All right, we're going to try to get in focus. There we go. That's kind of how the new year starts off for everybody. A little out of focus, a little fuzzy. How's everybody doing? Just give me a thumbs up if we've got good audio, good video. Everybody's on the chat. Reminding myself how to do all of this. And babysitting all the different technology all at the same time while still being able to talk to you guys. So awesome. Thanks for the thumbs up, guys. Hope everybody is doing great. I had a pretty extended holiday season. Christmas, New Year's, kids were off for probably a little too long, but they had quite the break this year. Oh, I think it was just a little over 2 weeks. And so, yeah, it's been a little bit of a slow transition back into the real life. So anyways, here we are. I hope most of you guys were able to see the previous guitar amp modeler episode that I did right before Christmas. We had an amazing turnout for that one. Obviously, the Fractal Gift of Tone preset went out, so we got a lot of new viewers from that. I thank you all for the new subscribers, and had a lot of people DM me with comments and questions, all very positive. A lot of the questions actually sparked the second installment of this, because although I kind of quickly and briefly touched upon the kind of the cabinet part of amp modelers, it really deserves its own conversation. And when I say cabinets, impulse responses, cabinet simulators. I mean, now there's a lot of like what used to be just an IR and an IR loader has now turned into these apps or plugins where you can kind of drag around the mic and change the angle, and which makes it a lot more lifelike. Might not be the right word, but it gives it an interface that's more familiar, and it also makes tweaking a lot easier. Because one of my big gripes with IRs, I think the first bundle of IRs that I ever bought, I think there was like 6,000 IR files. So number one, how do you navigate them? How do you know what you're looking at? How do you know what you're looking for? If you know what you're looking for instance, if you are used to miking a cabinet with a 57, a couple inches back off of a vintage 30 and a Marshall cabinet, yeah, you could find that. But scrolling through, previewing, if you didn't have experience with cabinets and microphones and all of that stuff, knowing just knowing where to start was such an issue that I feel like a lot of people wrote off the technology, for lack of a better term, because it just wasn't like user friendly. The experience was not great, and so a lot of the companies, obviously ML has got their Miko plugin. The red wires. I mean, we'll go through them all today, but the thing that really kind of sparked a lot of this conversation was how many comments I got from people on the Fractal Dynacab, which was their new way of doing that interface. So instead of having to scroll through and load IR files, it's got a little microphone, and we'll dig into that as well today. So what I wanted to start off with, and I think you guys will probably kind of know what I'm getting at, but I want to start off by scrolling through, and I've got basically, I've got a little plugin here covering up what's going on under the scenes, but I'm going to basically scroll through. When I say scroll, I'm going to A, B, C, D, E, F, G, a bunch of different sounds. And as I'm playing them, I want, man, what's the best way to do this? Maybe I'll go through and I'll say what they are. Pay attention to what number I'm telling you it is, and I want you to tell me afterwards. I want you to comment on what you think sounds the best. Okay, and the best is going to be a relative term, because that's going to be a little bit different for all of us. But here we go. I might have just flashed something to you guys. All right, so I've got my trusty guitar riff here that I think we used in the amp modeler previous version. So let me play here and make sure we're getting signal. Give me a thumbs up if we've got signal coming through here. Okay, so that's our guitar riff. Wait for everybody to give me thumbs up. I think we're good. Thank you, Paul. Okay, here we go. I'm just going to give you guys probably, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I got 9 options here. Okay. And I'm going to, what I'll do is I'll do one of these. Okay. All right, here we go. We're going to start with number 1. Okay, I want everybody to go in the comments. Sorry if you guys couldn't see my hands, but I think you could hear when they were switching. There was 9 of them. We went 1 through 9. I want everybody to go in the comments right now and say what their favorite was. I'll play the Jeopardy music. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. Do, boom, boom. Okay. 2, I think. 2 and the last one. Okay. This is awesome. Okay. We have a couple 1s. We've got a couple 2s. We've got a couple 4s. We've got a couple 5s. I didn't see any 6s in there. I see a 7. Didn't see any 8s. Did I get any 9s? Yeah, and I got 1 9. Okay. There's no right answer. You guys are all wrong. I'm the only one who's right. Okay. I'm gonna switch you guys to the chat here. I want to be able to document kind of who said what here. Okay, now it's in the video. I'm holding you guys accountable. All right. Before I reveal what exactly all those numbers were, this proves a point. And I wanted to do it this way because I needed to prove a point so we could have this conversation objectively. We had probably 10 people answer. And although there were a few consistent answers or preferences, there wasn't one that was overwhelmingly picked, right? So why would this be? Why didn't everybody say, did anybody say 3? Okay. Why didn't everybody say 3? Nobody said 3. Why didn't everybody, how many people said 2? We got a couple 2s. Why didn't everybody say 2? Everybody has different tastes. Everybody's looking for something different. Everybody hears differently. Our ears work differently. What you're listening on is a big filter. So if you're listening on an iPhone or on a computer, you might have had a different experience than somebody who's listening on, $600 headphones or earbuds or whatever, right? So we need to have this conversation right out of the gate so that we can all agree, number one, so that way we can cut past the bullshit of there is no best for all of us. There is no right answer for all of us or for every scenario. Obviously, we're listening in solo, which is obviously not how people hear guitar tones anyways. So there's a bunch of considerations that we need to consider when we're talking about what is good and what's not, and what's the best and what's not. And so if we're going to have this conversation objectively and constructively and kind of cut through the preconceived notions, if you will, we need to acknowledge that they're unless we can really clearly define the criteria of what's the best, we can't pick the best. Okay. So I am going to, I said I'd give away a copy of the CB4 plugin. So just so you know, what we were hearing right then was a DI track running through the CB4 with the cabinet turned off. That was what we were listening to. I want anybody to be as bold as to try and guess whatever your favorite, whatever one you thought sounded the best. I want somebody to boldly guess if that was an IR, a real amp cabinet, or some form of these new kind of like Dynacab things. And let's see if anybody can accurately pick this out, blind, not knowing really what they were listening for, not knowing what they were listening to. Let's see who's got the cojones to put themselves out there and document it. And whoever gets it right will get the CB4. And if nobody gets it right, then I'll give I'll give it to whoever says the answer, whoever gets their answer first for having the most nuts to kind of put themselves out there. Okay, Paul. 2 was Dyna, I'm guessing. Okay. 4 was a static IR. Okay. 2 is a dynamic IR. Okay. 5, and it was an IR. Okay. 1 IR. Okay. Let's get any more. Nobody's saying any of them are real amps. Nobody's saying, not one person is saying it's a real cabinet. Because I might have thrown a wild card in there for you. 4 Dyna. Okay. I'll give you two more seconds. And I think Paul might be winning the CB4. Because I don't know if anybody's actually right. IRs are real cabinets. Okay, well, let's agree. Let's all agree in this scenario. I'm talking about running a live mic, recording a mic signal of the cabinet with the guitar signal, not an IR. So I don't disagree with that statement. It's kind of like when people say, "Oh, that's a sample," and you're like, "Yeah, well, a sample is a drum. It was a sample of a real drum," and it's like, okay, yeah, but for argument's sake and for conversational sake, let's just kind of now make the non-judgmental agreement that an IR is not a quote-unquote real cabinet, live cabinet, whatever you want to call it. Okay. If 2 is not a Dyna, then I would guess that's a cab with a 57. Okay. Good guess, Sean. Okay, so we're going to do a reveal here. Paul, you're going to get the CB4 because you were the first one to stick your hand up and be brave and throw yourself out there for basically making. I mean, ultimately, it's a guess. We don't know, right? I mean, I had so many people comment on albums that I've done, being like, "Oh man, would the guitar sound so great? What cabinets were you using?" I'm like, "Oh, that was just a stock patch in whatever amp farm." So, all right, here's the reveal. And I went actually in the opposite order. Number 1 was the Helix plugin with a 4x12 Cali. I'm assuming that's like a Mesa with a 57 kind of off axis a little bit. Okay, so that was number 1. Number 2 is the Neural DSP Gojira plugin. And this had just the 57. This 160's off. I pulled that down. Okay. Number 3 is Amplitude with a Mesa 57. Number 4 was an Ownhammer IR, just loaded into Convology XT, which is an IR player. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 was GGD Zilla with an oversized straight. Number 6 was the Make Believe Studio SPRES, but I had it all dragged all the way to the right here. Where are we at? 7? 7's the Miko 2. 8 is a Recto cab from Redwires. Just a single SM57. This is this is their interface, but it's relatively a static IR. And then number 9 was actually this guy, which was a Recto Dynacab with just one single mic on it. So the point of this exercise, number 1, obviously, is we can get really great results with a variety of tools. These are all just tools. We already proved that 10 people liked basically 5 different things. And from that, we now can have an objective conceived notion that a live cabinet, or let's say a real cabinet while they're playing, is like the only way to go, or it's so much better, or whatever the argument typically is. Like, that's not constructive, right? The constructive way to talk about it or think about it is, well, what are you looking for? What is it lacking? What do you like? What do you want? What's the situation? And again, I wanted to clarify in this particular situation, I'm a producer, I'm a mixer. I do track guitars. Obviously when I'm producing, or if I'm engineering for another producer. In this context, the context of this conversation that we're having right now, I'm not talking about playing at home. I'm not talking about playing on stage. I'm like none of that. I'm talking about this as a tool for recording your guitar and having that be part of a production that people listen to on some sort of listening device. So for instance, I get the whole feel thing. I get the whole, oh, I like the vibration, or I like the moving in the air and blah, blah, blah. Nobody, whoever listens to your music through a speaker or through ear headphone, nobody ever hears that, or nobody ever feels that air, right? So let's forget about the air and let's talk about the sound. And if we're thinking that there might be something lacking from an IR, or lacking from a Dynacab or something of that nature, that maybe is making it less desirable for somebody, just saying, oh, I just like the feel of air, or I just have to have air moving. Like, it doesn't mean anything. It's so just, it's kind of abstract when we're talking about a production and in the context of a production. So anyways, it's kind of my little disclosure here for this kind of display and conversation. So really quickly, I'm going to go to the chat before we start digging into some of these IRs, because I think it was that was a fun little experiment that I've had that exact same test. I've done that with clients. I've done that with other guitar players, other producers, where we've really done this blindly, and we've done this with no preconceived notions. And it's amazing how varied the results are. The results are so varied that the one thing I do know for a fact is that there is no consensus on what is the best and what is better or whatever. That's what I do know for a fact. There's no consensus. So for somebody to tell you otherwise, they're full of shit. Okay. I'm going to look at the chat here. IRs are really, if 2 is not a Dyna, then I would guess that's a cab with the 57. So that was the Neural. 2 makes a lot of sense. That was a great IR model. Yeah, absolutely. That Neural Gojira plugin is probably one that I get probably the most when people send me sessions that still have plugins on it. I see that plugin all over the place. It sounds good. It is really great. So, Oh, thanks for joining, everybody. I'm glad you guys are digging the presets. Speaking of presets, if you haven't already, I tweaked my website a little bit, so you can go to my website, and at the very, very bottom, there's a spot that you can put your name and your email address, and you can get on my subscription list. And what I'm going to be doing, I've already sent out a couple emails with Fractal presets, with some cab block libraries for the fractals. I'm also going to start including some plugin presets. So some of these amp sims that I do like, I can save a preset and export them. And eventually I will get my website set up to where you can just log in and go and download files. So if you missed the mailer, the email that goes out, I'm going to try to send out an email every couple weeks at the least. But until I do that, I'll send out everything that I've sent out up into that point over again. So if you haven't signed up yet, please do so. And once I've got some new drum samples and mix templates and all that stuff, I'll start giving that stuff away, because I want you guys to have some goodies. So, all right, let's dig in. So the first thing I want to start with is, we're gonna play around a little bit with, what should we play around with? Because I used the fractal on the last one, maybe we'll start there. Yeah, let's start on the fractal, because I don't know how much I actually dug in on that one. So. All right. Okay, hopefully everybody can hear that. Okay, here's what we're going to do. So the cab block is a really interesting thing. And when I say a cab block, you can insert your own IR in this scenario. You could, if we're talking about GGD, whatever, all of the plugins that I just went through. And yes, I haven't included them all. There are like the universal audio aux is a really great option. The 2-notes captors have a lot of really cool stuff. I just don't use them, and I don't have them. I don't use them right now. Maybe I will in the future, but so there are things that I have omitted just simply because I don't use them or I don't have them. So just because I'm not using it doesn't mean it's awesome. Just because I'm using something here doesn't mean that I use it all the time. It's just, I went through and kind of found a bunch of things that I liked. So, but I guess the point that I wanted to make with right out of the gate was how much you can change the sound with the same IR or the same speaker cabinet IR, but with different positioning, with different microphones, with different on-axis, off-axis, and we haven't even started talking about like mixing IRs. And so for somebody to really get the full benefit of using an IR, you kind of have to invest a little bit of time into tweaking it and understanding kind of how to use them, because I guess real amps are the same way, but I feel like, and again, I keep on using the word real for this particular conversation. Remember, I'm like, yes, I get IRs are samples of real cabinets, but just so forgive my vernacular. But I think, with a guitar cabinet that you go out and mic up, you stick a 57 on a vintage 30. That's let's say a Mesa or a Marshall cabinet. There's kind of a starting point that most people just kind of start at. They put it somewhere around the cone or just off the cone, or the dust cap a little bit, just off the cap a little bit, whatever. Like everybody's kind of got their starting point. And unless you've got a Dynamount, like one of those robots, or you've got an assistant in there moving it around, for the most part, I know so many people who just go and kind of blindly place a mic, and then they're like, yeah, cool. And then they start tweaking the amp. With an IR, you can absolutely do that, but you got to find that IR that is kind of your home base, that is your starting place. And again, if there are 6,000 IR files in a library that you purchased, or even in the Fractal library, there just are so many. What it happens is you start getting so zoned in that it starts just making everything sound like shit. And then ultimately you lose objectivity and everything goes out the window. So that's something that I don't find when people are miking up guitar cabinets. I've never experienced somebody, I'd say in a regular scenario of recording or even live, I've very rarely spent more than 5-10 minutes at the most positioning a microphone. Yet I know people who have spent an hour scrolling through IRs. And that's just not productive. So one of the ways that I think this has kind of been solved is by these Dynacabs. And like I said, Miko's got it. The Amplitude's got it. Like the Neural's got it. Like this is the reason why it went this way is because of how much better this is. And I will tell you right now, with absolute certainty, moving this little mic position, like on the screen, moving it 3 or 4 points in either direction will make a bigger sonic difference than anything else in your whole recording chain. And so just to show you how that works, watch this. There is not one part of the recording chain, mic preamp, even like what mic you're using, the amp that you're using, the cable that you're using, the pickup that you're using, the guitar that you're using. There's nothing that can affect the sound as drastically as just doing what I just did. And so this needs to be almost like the thing that you learn to use the most, and you learn to find the things that you like the most, that are the most, that gel the most with your style, that gel the most with what you want to hear, what you're going after. And I don't think a lot of people do this with much intent, which is the reason why it makes it so hard to figure out. The other thing I will say, just when we're talking about comparing cabinets to IRs, or cabinets to cabinet simulators, the only way to objectively compare the two is to actually record both, stop playing, turn the amps off, and listen to playback and compare them that way. There are a couple different reasons for that. Number one, depending on what your recording system is when you're playing. If you're playing live and you're trying to make the judgment while you're playing live, sometimes there's latency. If you've got the amp in the other room, even if it's in an ISO cab, or not an ISO cab, but like an ISO booth, or if it's in a like a good studio that's pretty soundproof, there's still a little bit of vibrations that comes through the floor that can give the illusion that there's like a low end, a bigger low end, or a fuller low end, or just you literally feel the vibration. You're like, oh, that's way better. But as soon as you turn the amp off and just listen to playback, it's a lot more objective, because you're removing variables that ultimately those kind of don't matter. Again, in the context of what's coming out of the speakers. If you're talking about what do I like playing more, do I get more enjoyment feeling those vibrations? Do I get more enjoyment, quote unquote, moving the air and then being in front of a cabinet? Does the guitar interact with the cabinet? Yes, 100%. This all does make a difference, but you have to be very intentional about, well, how are you comparing this? And a lot of the times with IRs, people are not comparing apples to apples. They're playing live through it and saying, oh, the cabinet's better because of all these reasons that would make it better. But ultimately, once the track's recorded and is coming up the speakers, it's a lot more of a toss-up than I think a lot of guitar players would like to agree upon. So that's the Dynacab for you. It's pretty incredible, just like I said, how much you can make a difference. And the other thing that I find interesting is when people talk about amp modelers, like, oh, there's this high end, there's this high end. Well, here's what happens. I'll show you the stock setting of when you turn on the Dynacab. This is like the stock setting of what pops up. Okay, so if you want to get rid of some high end, or if there's some high end bugging you, if it was a real mic, what would you do? Like if you stuck a mic right in the center of the cap on any amp, it's probably going to be too bright. Well, you would start moving it off. So let's do that here. And it should be that quick and simple. This is not something that you should like belabor over, being like, "Ooh, there's that, and there's it's a little." Because if it was a real mic, you wouldn't be doing that. If it was a mic in a cabinet and you had to go in the other room, you'd move it. First of all, you're not hearing it in real time. You're just guessing where you're going to move it. Again, unless you have somebody moving it for you, or you know, an arm or something. And so, like, it's almost like unfairly compared, because what you can do with this, you wouldn't do in the other scenario. So again, try to take the benefits of working with a microphone and apply them to some of these Dynacab options, where don't get so nitpicky with it. Don't worry about what this number here says. Don't worry about, you know, some of the even some of the visuals of the position. Don't be like, oh, I'd never put a mic way out there on a cab. Like, just use your ears and move this thing around to where it sounds good, because that's exactly what you would do with a real cab. And because you're doing that with the real cab, you're most likely exclusively using your ears as the judge, and you're going to find something that you end up liking very easily. I think a lot of people don't like IRs because they're like, oh, it just doesn't sound good, because they tweak too much and they get too hung up on the visuals and the graphics and the numbers and all this other stuff, to where they don't just, you know, move this thing around a little bit and be like, cool, that sounds good, move on. Look at the chat really quickly. It's got a couple questions coming in here. When making your own IRs, are there any particular power amps or effects loops, return power section of tube amp you're using? Okay. This is another interesting question. And I find, you know, I don't want to shit all over like the amp companies, because, you know, obviously, you know, they make hardware, they make amps. They're not looking to move to being a software company. They don't, like, obviously, right? But here's where I find there's a really big disconnect with a lot of amp builders or amp companies that, you know, obviously, you know, they like what they do. You know, they wouldn't sell an amp, or they wouldn't design an amp they didn't like, and you wouldn't get to that point. But there's a lot of conversations that are just, again, going back to, like, just, they're not constructive. There's a big disconnect with a lot of the amp builders and manufacturers and guys like us who are using these amp sims, and they almost look at amp sims as that's just kind of like a, you know, that's like a you know, that's for somebody who's just doesn't really know, or they don't have the ears, or they can't tell, or they don't have any money, or they, you know, they're lazy or whatever. And I'm getting to your question. This is a little bit of a roundabout way of getting there. But the interesting thing is, I feel like if they would be collaborative, and they would be, I don't want to say help take what they know and apply it to these scenarios of, how do we record IRs? How do we make IRs? How do we reproduce the IRs? And I feel like if there was a little bit more collaboration, I think there would be probably a lot. I feel like the IR technology would be pushed further. And there would be maybe, I don't want to say a standard, but there would be a little bit more of a, hey, we've tried all of the different ways of doing this, and this is the thing that's the most lifelike, or this is the thing that's closest to having a cabinet in the room with you, or this is the reproduces like the cabinet compression or the speaker compression when you're overdriving the speaker a little too hard, or whatever. The impedance curves. There's so many different variables that unfortunately amp sims and IRs do have a little bit of a disconnect. Because you're not physically connecting them, and the amp sim doesn't know what the cabinet is the way that an amp would know what the cabinet is. I mean, it doesn't know what the cabinet is, but the load that it gets and the impedance, the resistance that it gets, and that all interacts. We don't have that interaction in the IR world the way. I mean, I'm not a electrical engineer or an amp designer, but from the little bit I do know is that's one of the hardest parts of the whole amp modeling world, is figuring out how do you replicate that connection that you get. And I feel like, with the exception of a few I'll call them amp builders, so the amp designers, whatever you want to call them, there are a few who are actually interested in being like, yeah, how do we move this forward? Like, how do we integrate this? How do we figure this out? I feel like a little bit of this conversation or a little bit of this debate feels to me like in 1999 when like there was still conversation, or even like later than that, 2004, there was still like, there were people who were like, you can't make a good sounding record in Pro Tools. It has to be tape. Pro Tools sounds like shit. And people were not interested. There were a lot of people who were just so hung up. And trust me, I was actually one of them when it came to like in the box mixing versus console mixing, large format console mixing. I was one of them. I was like, it can't be done. Can't be done well. It's not even close. Once the conversation started changing, instead of saying we can't do it, the conversation turned into, how do we do it? And you started getting the guys who were designing consoles and outboard gear and microphones. You got them involved in the software because they had to, because nobody was buying $500,000 consoles. Nobody was buying $100,000 tape machines. The only way for them to stay in business was to be part of the solution of, okay, yes, there are going to be people who use tape. Tape has a thing. Great. The people who want to use tape are still going to use tape. The people who want to mix on a console, they're still going to mix on a console. That's fine. But let's be part of bridging that gap. And once they started jumping in, and I'm not saying it was all of them, a lot of them didn't. And a lot of them just kind of went under or kind of disappeared. But it's amazing, like a company like Universal Audio is a good example. They made the most classic hardware that we have pretty much used in the studio for a very, very, very long time. And instead of saying, nah, plugins sound like shit, you can't mix an album with plugins, or plugins are like the inferior, clone, wannabe make-believe version of this hardware piece, they said, no, let's figure out a way to where we can actually make this stuff really sound good. And now I would be shocked if you put 10 people in a room and said, is Universal Audio a software company or a hardware company? And the majority of them said hardware. I bet it would probably be the opposite. So I told you this was going to be a little bit of a ramble. The thing that bugs me, and I guess your question kind of sparked it, was like, okay, has an amp manufacturer really jumped in and said, okay, well, let's bridge this gap and let's build something that bridges this gap? And there are a few. I know like John Suhr makes his load box, which is great. That's probably the one that I probably hear most people using with their amps when they want to use a real amp with a cabinet. Obviously, there are others out there. You're starting to see some amps come with cabinet or directs, cabinet IRs or like direct outs built into them, and that is helping that. But there's still a lot of guys out there. There's still a lot of companies who are just looking at this world as some sort of inferior BS, and I get it. They don't want to, go the way of the dinosaurs, where they're making really expensive amps that only a few people are using 10 years from now. So I think it would be helpful, and I would love to see more traditional amp companies getting involved with bridging this gap. For instance, this is why I went on this big long ramble here, or rant. It would be awesome for amp companies to make a device specifically for creating and capturing IRs in a very standard, controlled way that would then lead to us getting the best results. There are some best practices. There are some people who think one way is better than the other. I'm not super well versed in that, believe it or not. I've done some very, very basic IR captures that some of them I've used on albums that you guys have heard. And I'm always talking to people and reading up on different ways to do that. And I'm obviously very, I'm vested in making amp modeling as good as it can be. So that way I have a tool to use that's convenient and good quality and all of that stuff. But yeah, a couple people in the chat here, like Friedman's starting to embrace IR tech. I'm sure, but it's like one of those things where, they're embracing IR tech, but then there's lots of commentary on how, like, all the emulation stuff sounds like crap. So it's like I said, there needs to be a little bit of a paradigm shift where it's, instead of just discarding or saying, we just got to, feed the lowest common denominator here and we got to, pay the bills, be truly interested in pushing the technology forward. And yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm very interested to see what happens. Soldano Astra is using software and IR loading too. Interesting. I didn't know that about Soldano. I know the Rev amps. That's one that I've seen and really heard a lot. And there's a strong push from them to kind of get that part of that amp to be a very powerful tool. Yeah, Fender has the new modeler. Again, it was one of those things where is that a business decision of like, we got to follow the money, or is that truly wanting to push the technology forward? Tough to say. I would hope. I don't know. I would hope that was the motive. But I feel like there's still a disconnect, and there's still a kind of a divide. You've got your amp guys and you've got your modeling guys, and ultimately these are just tools. I had a call with a new client the other day. I think I saw him on the call or in the chat here, but we were talking about this, and I used it, and I often use like food analogies when I'm talking about audio. I don't know why. I'm not like necessarily like a foodie, but I feel like it's something people can understand. And we were talking about kind of gear and cabinets and amps and all the stuff, and I made the analogy. I said, listen, these are all just tools. These are all tools that we use to create what we want to create. So I don't know of that many people. There's one person I can think of that might have done this. I don't know too many people who go to a restaurant, sit down, eat the food, either say, this is the best food I've had, or this is the shittiest food I've had. I want to know what pan this was cooked in, or what cutlery was used to cut the steak, what knife was used, or, blah, blah. Like, nobody cares. It's either good or it's not. And ultimately, it's not which pan your chicken was, broiled in or whatever. It was all of the other stuff. It was all the decisions that were made going into cooking that food that ultimately is what you care about. So it's interesting how, like, we get really caught up on some really nitpicky particulars when ultimately it kind of doesn't matter. And again, it's until everybody just kind of gets over that stigma of like, oh, well, it's fake. Who cares? Who cares? Does it sound good? Does it not? And if there is a potential for, wow, you know what? That does sound really good. I can put my preconceived notions or my ego or whatever else aside and my biases aside and just be like, yeah, you know what? That sounds really good. That Gojira plugin from Neural DSP sounds really, really good. Cool. All right. So we can agree that there is some potential in this technology. I like hardware. I like being able to touch and feel things. When I come into the studio and I've got a young band who's never seen a diesel VH4 in real life and they see it, it gets them excited. There's an inspirational factor there. So there are really good benefits of this stuff. And again, if you're playing in the room, if you're in the studio and the guitar player is just like, I don't like the feel, like there's almost like a little bit of a latency that I don't like, blah, 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 with the plugin. Cool. Awesome. We'll use a real amp. Like, let's make this the best it can be for you. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about sound, like, let's just make sure we're comparing apples to apples and not kind of letting the other stuff creep in. So, let's go back to the chat here. Sorry, I'm going on rants tonight. Reggie. I'm not sure what that means, Paul. What's Reggie mean? Oh, Rev. Yeah. That was really smart. Putting the two notes in their head. That's awesome. Like give people the option. Hybrid system, real amp, load box. Load boxes are really different from one another. One solution I like are the Rev amps with integrated two notes. Yeah, and that's a great example. Like being able to like, you have a little bit of control over that. Like Rev has a little bit of control over that. Like they know what the amp schematic is. They know what they can. I don't know if they're kind of bridging the gap with, impedance curves and stuff like that. Like the way that a real speaker would the damping would be different based off of different amps and that type of thing. But if they are taking advantage of that, which I hope they are, like that's a good example of like, yes, you're bridging that gap, and making, instead of just saying, emulators suck, they don't sound as good, taking the approach of like, okay, well, they sound really good. Maybe they don't sound the way that my amp over here does, but what could we do to bridge that gap? What could we do to kind of fill in some of those things? So, from the reviews I've seen, it wasn't to push the modeler. Oh, okay, cool. I always feel awkward when my gear friends ask me to explain how I'm getting my sound, and I tell them it's Kemper or Modeler or Godin. Well, you know what? Here's the thing. This is such an exact example of just like, I really feel strongly about, and I don't mean to preach, I really don't, but I do feel strongly about like, can we just have don't have to pick sides. I'm not going to think less of somebody if they're like, oh, I don't like modelers, or if they're like, oh yeah, that's a great sound. Oh, it's a modeler. Ugh. Like, who cares? I really don't care. But I had somebody reach out to me. I've probably told this story before. I might have even told it on the last YouTube live stream. But anyways, I'll tell it again. When the last Nickelback album came out, that the first single, San Quentin. I mean, I'm very proud of. I mean, I'm proud of all the work that I've done with Nickelback. I'm very proud of that song and the way that it turned out. That was one of the best. I feel like kind of like the best productions and mixes and just everything kind of came together on that one, and a couple of the other songs on the album as well. But obviously that song connected with a lot of people, and a lot of people heard it and listened to it. I had a lot of people reach out to me and comment on the sound of that song. And I had this happened 3 times, but one person in particular reached out to me on Facebook and got into a really detailed conversation about the guitars and wanted to know what the guitars were. And I could kind of got a little bit of a feel like where this was going in terms of a little bit of a preconceived notion. They wanted information. Oh, what guitars did you use? What gauge strings? Was that the pickup from whatever? Then they were just, they obviously knew a lot of kind of they were a Nickelback fan, knew a lot of like the guitars Chad plays, which he's actually probably one of the least picky people in the studio. Like, we'll just grab 5 guitars and we'll plug in. Yeah, that sounds good. Stays in tune, rings, feels good. Okay, go. There's not a lot of like tweaky natured selection going on. And so I don't want to say I was a little bit sheepish with answering the question, but I would see what I'm dealing with. And then it got to, what amps were you guys using? Where, was that the rectifier rack head? Because that's what they've used live for so long, and people have seen that and they know that. So there was just the assumption. And I might have said, I might have BS'd, and I might have said, yeah, that's what it was. And then he was like, oh man, I knew it. Those are the best guitars I've ever heard, blah, blah, blah. I'm so glad you guys didn't use modelers. Everybody's using like plugins these days. I'm so glad somebody's using real amps. And so then I had to backtrack. And so I kind of said, they asked a few more questions. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to open up the session. Let me go open up the session and I'll have a peek and see, and I'll get back to you on the details. So then I let a day go by, and then I replied back and I said, oh, interestingly enough, I completely misspoke in my last message. When I went back and looked at the session, there were a couple other songs that we used, X, Y, and Z that he guessed. For San Quentin, we actually used, what did I say? I think, we used the Fractal and we used the CB4. So I told him that at that particular time. And then his next response was, yeah, you know what? I went back and listened really closely, and I could definitely hear that it was it wasn't a real amp. And I just had to laugh to myself. And I'm just like, what? Like, why? What's the point? And it really, and that's not an isolated scenario. I think more people are probably like kind of have that lean than I think they would like to admit. And I used to really like have a lot of, kind of preconceived notions or biases that I was like, oh, that amp, that amp sucks. JCM 900 sound like shit. And I was like, interesting. I remember like 10 years, that's what every guitar player had. And there was actually I remember going to some shows and be like, fuck, your guitar sounds great. JCM 900. It's like, just because everybody says the 900 is crap doesn't mean it's always crap, right? So, yeah, no, exactly. I'm just looking at the chat here. People are kind of laughing at that story, but ultimately, one of the goals with me just doing these live streams and sharing some of this stuff, and I've probably gone on for an hour about this now, so we can move on after this, but I just want to get people over it's not doing it. Nobody is benefiting from being closed-minded about the tools that we're using or the techniques that we're using or any of this stuff. You're not, if you think you're doing yourself a favor by sticking that flag in the ground and or what's the term? Live and die by the sword, of whatever your thing is, and you're not being open-minded, the only person who is losing is you. And then if you are a professional, you are doing a disservice to your clients by not being open-minded about something as simple as using a cabinet IR, because you have some preconceived notion that miking up a cab is the only way to get a good sound. Sorry, that's the reality of it. And like I said, that's the thing I just want people to really, really, really understand, because even having seen this go down, I've only been in the industry. I mean, I got into the industry at a time when a lot was changing. Like I said, things were turning into Pro Tools really fast. I caught the tail end of tape. I caught the tail end of like ADATs and DA88s and radars and stuff like that. So I have done records on that. But the thing that just seems insane to me is that we are still hung up and having these debates over, just insignificant little pieces of the pie. When ultimately, if you're open-minded, make the best decision for that particular case, good to go. So, anyone else getting a choppy gate sound, or is that just me? You know what? I actually just had a couple little internet issues. I don't know what's going on right now. We are having, what do they refer to it as, the Arctic outflow? Last night I thought my house was going to blow down the street. It was so windy. Have been getting some little like power issues, so I apologize if that's happening. Give me the thumbs up if we're still good. Jeff, whatever. Vinyl sounds way better. Totally. We should still do vinyl. When was the last time you cut anything on vinyl, Jeff? Chris, do you ever mix on headphones? If so, which ones? Do you think you need $1,400 headphones to mix a record, or can you mix on much cheaper headphones? I've absolutely done mixes on headphones. I'm trying to think. One of the headphones that I use a lot in the studio are the Audio-Technica ATH50s. Yeah, ATH50s. And I have done mixes on those, just out of like necessity. I eventually actually switched over to these. I think these are Sennheiser 650s. And to be perfectly honest with you, with the exception of like low end, like really low end, these 650s are probably some of my favorite, like speakers, headphones, whatever. Just like the balance and the frequency response of these is probably one of my favorite monitoring options. The only problem is they don't give you a lot of low end. But so I always have to reference. But all the mixes that you guys have heard that I have done, I've probably had these Sennheiser 650s on for, I don't know, maybe 30% of it at the least. And anything prior to maybe like 5 years ago, I would always reference on those ATH 50s, Sony 7506. I don't own $1,400 headphones. I don't own $1,400 headphones. I know a lot of guys who mix on the Apple over the ear, whatever they're called, AirPod Pros. I know guys who are mixing on those. I know guys who are mixing on the earbuds. So again, kind of what I'm getting at with IRs, amps, I guess, like we could apply that same logic of, can you make a good record with an amp modeler, or do you need a real amp? That's the same question of, can you mix a record on a $200 pair of headphones, or do you need a $1,400 pair of headphones? That's the same question, just different semantics, right? So if the headphones that you like the best and that you do the best work on, because that's two separate things, and I'll explain that really quickly before we will move on. If they're $1,400, you might have to buy $1,400 headphones. If you can find an option that's $100, well, awesome, go for it. And I did say something really quickly there that I want to circle back on. What you like the sound of best and what you get the best results working on, to me, is two different things. And I think a lot of people pick what they like the sound of instead of what they get the best results by using. I do not like the sound of NS10s. I've never listened to an NS10 and just been like, oh, that sounds so good. I just want to listen to all my favorite records on these. It's never happened. they made me work in such a way that I got really good results, or I felt like I was getting really good results on NS10s. I've since found something that kind of bridges the gap a little more, that I enjoy listening to more, that still makes me work hard enough to get good results. But yeah, it's two different things. So don't just go get the headphones that you're like, oh, these sound amazing. These 650s, they're open back, so there's no isolation. They sound good, but I mean, if I'm just listening, if I just want to listen to a record, I want to put on a, Peter Gabriel album and just like close my eyes and turn the lights off and listen to 60 minutes of awesome music or something. I'm not putting these on. I'll put something else on. I've got probably like 6 pairs of headphones. I'll put something else on. So, sorry, back to the chat here. -30 in Montana. Yeah, that's about right. I saw a lot of the ski resorts were closed. It was so damn cold. So, Paul, there's a couple mods for the low end on those. I don't like opening my headphones like that though. Yeah, I don't know if maybe I'll experiment with another set at some point. So, okay, let's go back into the session here, because I literally spent an hour basically defending and having a debate with myself or with this invisible opponent as to why IRs can be good. I want to actually now go into just using IRs. I want to show a couple just like quick things that can make working with IRs a lot better. Again, how do we define better? Whatever. Okay. Let's dig back in. Okay. So one of the things that we're going to do is I find a lot of people, either when mixing IRs with a real amp, when mixing IRs with a real amp, or even trying to mix IRs or trying to mix amp modelers, like there's some really bizarre phase. Like you could plug 3 amps in with a splitter and get a microphone on each one of them, and chances are like it's going to sound okay. The same thing does not happen when you're talking about using 3 different amp modelers and just hearing them all at the same time and mixing them together, using 3 different IRs. Like this does not add up a lot of the time. And I want to show you a couple of the tricks that I use to get around that. So I'm going to, what was everybody's favorite? Oh, the Gojira kind of got a lot of love. So 1 and 2, I think, got a lot of love in the blind test, right? So let's go to, 2 and, is it 2 and 7 or 2 and 8? It doesn't matter. Here's 2. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn on another IR, and we're going to try to mix with it. And you're going to hear how terrible this might sound. It might sound all right. All right, here we go. So, you know what? This is actually a really interesting plugin. This is a really simple, really good sounding, really simple IR player plugin, whatever. And I would say, if you are new to the amp modeling world, or you're new to the amp plugin world, and you have a tendency of getting into analysis paralysis, do yourself a favor, get this plugin. And because it has so limited options, it doesn't have a lot of options on it, number 1. And number 2, it's kind of hard. Like I don't even know if like you can make this quote unquote sound bad. Like it's going to sound good on most of the time. Just get this plugin and play with it. So if you've got real amps and like a load box or something, and you're kind of on the fence about this whole thing, just start with this. This is a great concept, great sound, awesome. Okay, so actually, you know what? We're going to start with this. So I'm going to turn off the Gojira plugin. Here's the I don't even know how to pronounce it. Sprez, S-P-R-E-S. Okay, we're going to start with that. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to turn on another amp sim, or not amp sim, another cabinet. Let's go with the Gojira. Let's go with something else, actually, because the Gojira was actually not too bad. I want to show you a problem that comes up a lot, and then a way to fix it. So really quickly here, we're going to go to this guy. So this is a static IR, very popular company that does really high quality IRs that I use a lot of. Ownhammer, I believe is how you pronounce it. And this is, whatever Mesa. I don't even know which one I had going there, but it doesn't matter. So I'm going to turn these both on here and hear how bad this sounds. Okay, we got some weird phasing going on there, and most people would just give up and be like, that sounds like shit, and move on. And that's, again, not a problem that comes up a ton in the amp world, because most people know, like, if I'm using two microphones, I got to kind of get them in phase. Well, the same thing applies here as well. So I want to show you a little trick that I use. There's a couple different ways you can do this. I use a plugin. It's an Eventide plugin called Precision Time Align, and it basically just lets you adjust the delay forwards and backwards to account for the phase. And this would be the equivalent of moving, if you have a 57 on an amp, and then you put a 421 or a 121 or another 57, this is like the equivalent of moving that mic to get it in phase. And again, people are dealing with IRs. They just think it's either in phase or it's out of phase, and that you're done. And that's not necessarily the case. You can use a plugin like this to sweep around it and to find a spot that actually sounds good. So let's do that. So that already, to me, sounds a lot better. And obviously you can see there's quite a bit of a delay difference, right? We're 82 samples off. Again, this is the equivalent of moving mics in the real world. And this is something that I kind of wanted to prove a point as well, because there is a little bit of a misnomer in the IR world that all IRs always need to be perfectly aligned. And you can actually use these phase adjustment sweeps as an EQ. It's almost like a very dynamic EQ, because you're not just EQing one frequency. As you move the phase, certain frequencies are canceling out. Certain frequencies are being enhanced or reinforced on just like on an infinite band of frequencies, really. And so using the phase as a tool can be a very powerful tone shaping tool. And if you were using something like any of the Dynacab stuff, let me pull that up really quickly. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit here. Okay, we're going to go to the Dynacab Fractal. So here's a perfect example. Yeah, so Sean actually just hit up on this. He's like, this would be the same as the fractal alignment tool. Yeah, so if you go to the Align tab on Axe Edit here, you can actually see I'm just delaying the dynamic mic a little bit. and it's canceling out some frequencies that's basically allowing the signal to get manipulated. Sometimes good, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it's better completely aligned. But I find again, talking about the real world and just trying to make that connection as to why there is such a big disconnect. No matter how hard you try, it's very, very difficult just based off of physics, I guess. You can't get two microphone capsules aligned in the same spot. It's impossible. You can get them the same distance from the source. That's not the same thing. Especially on a guitar cabinet where a guitar speaker, just a millimeter to one side, the sound changes. So it's actually impossible to get the same source positioning, let's say, with two different mics on a guitar cabinet, but you can with an IR. So when you're using IRs and everybody just plops them perfectly aligned like that, this is almost, I mean, I'll go as far as to say, like, this is next to impossible in the real world, the physical miking of a cabinet, because you couldn't get them in the exact same position. So I find a lot of the time with IRs, stacking them to where they're all perfectly aligned actually produces a relatively unfamiliar result if you are really, really used to miking up guitar cabinets in the kind of the traditional sense of the word. And so using something like this is really awesome. The thing I will say about the, and this is actually something I should mention to the Fractal guys, the thing that I don't really love about the align tool in here is, like, I find I'm never out here. Never. But yet I'm not even like, I'm probably using, probably a 20th of the knob value. So I kind of wish this knob would have much finer adjustment. Like, I feel like by the time you get to here, that to me, that's not useful. Whereas with the Eventide time align, like you could see how finely adjusting I'm getting there. So that's one thing that I will say a lot of people don't play enough with is the aligning of two IRs. Whereas, I mean, miking a guitar cabinet with two mics is almost standard these days. And people spend a lot of time or have a familiarity with how that's going to sound and a predictability with that. Yet that hasn't, again, that's another disconnect into this world that hasn't been really addressed from a wide variety of user interfaces. So that's something to be very, very aware of, is the alignment tool. And then the other thing the other thing I will dig into as well, that I think a lot of people, I don't know, maybe if they don't do this enough, I don't want to say they don't do this enough, but I feel like some people, the way that they have, the way that they might just stick a mic on a cab and be like, oh, that's the sound, we're good to go. And maybe they're fine with it, and they just, in their head, they're like, we don't need to do any more to that. That's fine. And then as soon as you put it through an IR, all of a sudden they're hyper focused and they're hearing all these little like whistle frequencies and stuff like that. So I'm also not afraid to dig in with a very sharp EQ and start chopping the crap out of some of these frequencies. So I'm going to switch back to the Gojira plugin here and show you a little bit about this. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time, because once you hear this, you're never going to be able to unhear it. Okay, so again, the biggest complaint I hear about IRs is people say there's like, either number one, they're like, oh, there's no body to it. And again, I think a lot of that is less about the fact that IRs actually don't have any low end, and it's more about the fact that people are choosing IRs that maybe aren't sonically representative of what they would have done, where they would have left the mic or where they would have put the mic on an actual cabinet. They typically, I think people typically just go for like the bright kind of center cone position of an IR, and then they're like, oh, that sounds like shit. It's all fizzly and there's no body to it. That's probably not what you would have left the mic in that position on either. So it's not fair to leave that IR. But probably the next most common complaint I hear about IRs and cab sims is there being kind of some weirdness in like the high mids. And I'm not going to say that that's not true, because I do hear that in some, and I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if it's maybe how the IRs were captured. I don't know if it's the interaction of an amp and a cabinet, the way that it changes based off of the input and based off of the power that's being sent. And there's just like I said, there's that interaction. Speakers don't sound the same at all volumes. So when you're pushing a speaker a certain way, the frequency response is going to be a little bit different. Whereas with an IR, you're kind of capturing a snapshot of what that happens to be. And so it isn't as dynamic. It doesn't need to be, in my opinion. Ultimately, I think like the way that tape machines used to be looked at as inferior because they had a bunch of hiss and they didn't reproduce the frequency curve the same way as somebody would hear when they were on input. Like, it's funny how we romanticize tape machines when back when all you had was tape, all they wanted was for their playback and their record medium to play it back the way they were hearing it when it was being recorded. They didn't want the saturation. They didn't want the low end bump. They didn't want the top end getting rolled off. They didn't want the transient softened. They didn't want any of that stuff. They wanted everything to be the way it was supposed to be. And I think speakers are similar. I think, yes, there's a distortion that some people like with certain speakers. Like I think of like a greenback. Like a greenback doesn't take much to distort. And I think a lot of people kind of like that. It adds to the sound. But I think there's probably, I think back in the day when, the heyday of guitar tones, I've read interviews and articles of people talking about this. They wanted a more linear frequency responses. They wanted more predictable. They didn't want it. They're like, oh, I want it to sound the same when it's quiet versus when it's loud. When I turn it up or when I've got lots of gain, all of a sudden the speaker doesn't sound the same. Or when it's quiet, it doesn't sound the same. Like they wanted a more kind of snapshot that worked. Not everybody, but they were. Like, I think again, we've romanticized the old stuff because it's fun, right? So, anyways. The snapshot part isn't so much the issue. I just don't, like I said, I don't exactly know why some IRs do have that problem, but it's a very easily fixed problem. So here we go. Okay, so this was one of everybody's favorites when we started, right? When you listen to this, I don't know, how long did it take me to EQ that? 25 seconds, maybe? There was two frequencies I was hearing that, and I wasn't really using the RTA here, like the meter. That's another problem people have. If you're using a plugin like Pro Q3 that's got a meter, don't just focus in on the frequency tops or the peaks and be like, oh, that's a problem. That might be the frequency that's making the thing sound awesome. Just because it's louder than everything else doesn't mean it needs to be pulled down. Just find the frequencies that are bugging you. And I heard this 2160-ish, and then there was something kind of a little bit lower in the 820. And for me, I find with, I'm usually doing one of 3 or 4 moves on one of these EQs when it comes to amp modelers, cabinet IRs, but I even do this sometimes with real amps. With real amps, I find that it's lower. It's a lot of like the low mid stuff that just gets so muddy and so gross. Again, I'm doing these same moves on a real amp and a real cabinet. I'm just doing different moves. But there's one of four moves I usually do when I'm dealing with IRs, or when I say IRs, with a real amp and an IR, or even an amp modeler with an IR. There's usually something in this like 2 to 3 range. There's usually something between like 8 and 1. I'm maybe rolling off some top end. And then sometimes I'm getting something in like a 4 to 5K range. This one, I'm not really getting that. But if I looked for it, I could probably find something to pull out there. So anyways, I'm going to play this with the reason why I just spoke for like 3 minutes is I wanted to give you a break from hearing it. I want to play the Gojira plugin here, the one that actually a lot of people thought sounded really good, and I did too. It sounds good. I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to turn this EQ on, and then I'm going to let you guys hear that, and then I'm going to turn the EQ off. And when I turn the EQ off, this thing is going to sound so bizarre that you're going to be like, how did anybody pick that as being like one of the best out of the bunch? Okay, here we go. All I hear when I bypass the EQ, it's all I could hear. We didn't hear that before though, right? So just like with anything in the studio, you stick a mic on a kick drum. Just stick a mic on a kick drum. If you just leave it, most of the time it's not going to be like, yeah, that sounds awesome. I'm doing a very similar thing on guitar cabinets. Like I said, I'm doing like one of 3 moves on guitar cabinets. It's just usually rolling off bottom end. It's chopping out some stuff like in like the 3 to 4 to 500 range. And then I usually still have this weird like 8 to 900 thing, depending on what kind of amp it is, or what kind of speaker it is. If it's a 412, I usually get that same thing. So, I mean, learn how to use the tools, learn how to manipulate them. And like, this is a really simple thing that can ultimately take away the things that your buddy down the street who loves guitar cabinets says, oh man, no, there's this weird like high-end thing. I'm like, okay, well, you open up that guy's session and he's got 45 bands of EQ going on the kick drum. Why not do 3 bands on the guitar amp sim? So anyways, I'm going to go to the chat real quick because I think this is blown people's minds a little bit. When you are doing these surgical cuts, do you aim for the fundamentals of one of the frequencies? You know what? I do one of 3 things. I'm already hearing that frequency. Like I don't really think about like quote unquote fundamentals as much as I'm just kind of listening to like what part of the signal bothers me. And this is for everything, for vocals, kick drums, snare drums. But this is when I'm mixing. I'm just kind of being hyper aware of like what bugs me about that. And if nothing bugs me about it, I don't do anything. So if somebody sends me a guitar track and I listen to it in context of the song or even in solo, and I'm like, nothing bugs me, I'm not going to do anything to it. I leave it. And there are mixes that I've done, and there are productions I've done when whatever source it is, there's nothing happening. If you're not really dialed in, like you're still kind of like learning how to like identify those things. One of the things that you saw me do to kind of, once I knew the area that I was looking for, because I could hear it. But then what I'll do is I'll let me go back to this real quick. I'll just boost a really narrow frequency, and I'll just move around the frequency. You don't have to use Pro Q3 for this. You can use whatever plugin you want, just something that's a little more surgical so you can get a nice narrow cut. You just kind of scroll around a little bit. Oh. What happened, man? Sorry, guys. Let's restart Pro Tools. How about that? You guys still there? Give me a thumbs up. I feel like I just lost internet. Okay, thanks, Paul. Restore my iLok Cloud session. I didn't know I had an iLok Cloud session. Oh, I had to go take my iLok to another computer the other day, and that must have been the problem. So it must have when I restored, when I moved the license, or I took my key over, maybe it wasn't on my key. Oh, I know what it is. I renewed my plugin or my Pro Tools subscription the other day, and I think it put it on the cloud instead of on my key. This is why people hate iLok. People who hate iLok must use the cloud. Don't use the cloud. Just put it on a key. Turtles, put it on a key, man. I've never had this. This is the first time I've ever had this problem in my life. Put it on a key. And the first thing I'm going to do when we finish today is I'm going to put my license back on the key. Okay. Well, we're waiting for Pro Tools to load my 45,000 plugins, because I do have 45,000 plugins. Don't nudge your USB hub. No shit. Paul, you know that well. I've got a USB hub that, if the wind blows the wrong way, it disconnects all of my peripherals. All right, let's... I'm going to go and open up, where was it? Pro Tools sessions. Let's go into here. Guitar cab IRs. I'm going to go to session backups because I don't know if I saved. I can't remember. 7. That's fine. Thanks for bearing with me. iLok throws spare licenses onto cloud automatically after recent update. Okay, that's what it is then. Thank you very much. Why is it looking at the cloud, though? It should look on my key. Whatever. You know what? I did see another plugin pop up. It popped up when we were talking about something else. But okay. Anyways, I was talking about how to find the frequency. So I'm going to reset this plugin really quickly here and see if we kind of find similar frequencies. So what I'll do is I'll just boost a really narrow cut, and I'll do this in real time. And all I'm doing is just I'm listening, not looking. I'm listening for the spot where that really gross frequency just starts tearing your face off, just gets enhanced. Okay, so here we go. Well, let me be sure I got my loop on here. I do. Okay, here we go. So right out of the gate, I'm hearing the kind of like a kind of like that frequency. So I'll go hunt that one down first. Right in there somewhere. Okay. And then now I'm hearing a little bit of almost like I can't even do it. It's kind of like a piercing whistle, not super. It's more kind of like a piercing kind of mid frequency. Okay. And then I'm just hearing some really high, like fizzy stuff that I probably don't need. Okay. So I can't even remember which frequencies the last batch, that last EQ we ended up at. But I would imagine this is somewhere close. You saw I wasn't like super precious with it, and I'm not. It's kind of like just find it and just suck it out a little bit. It doesn't have to be like, oh, is it 2148 or was it 2122? It's like you're gonna get in the ballpark, and as long as you grab it and pull it down, you're gonna solve the problem. So let's listen again to this with the EQ on, and then we're gonna turn the EQ off again. And when we're talking in context of like a hard rock production or a metal production, when you might have like quad guitars, you might have different layers doing different things. When that's the other thing is like even with a real amp and a real cab, like when you're just doing the same thing over and over again, with the same mic in the same position, these annoying frequencies start to build up. So it gets highlighted even more. And I think what tends to happen, again, I want to highlight variables in the real world that don't then get translated into the emulation world. If you let's say you record rhythm guitars for a song with an amp setup, okay? And then you do your best to document the settings and you do your best to make sure the mics don't move and all that stuff. Just the fact that you left it overnight and maybe the mic stand just started to move a little bit, or maybe, when you went to turn on the amp, maybe like just the tolerances of the knobs because the amp's just got turned on. Like there's other variables that might make it sound not exactly the same. So you're not getting this buildup that when you're talking about emulators and IRs, they're the same every time. So you can do yourself a little bit of a favor by, even if you want to have the same amp sound on the left and the right, you can do yourself a favor by do this exercise by ear. Don't copy this to the right side. Pull up the right side, EQ those whistles out just the way you just did the first one, and don't use the numbers, don't use your eyes, use your ears. And ultimately, the values are probably going to be similar, but just a slight bit different. That's going to get rid of some of that like layering and that buildup that you would otherwise get. And these little things, it's so quick, it's so easy. It can make the difference between somebody completely writing off your tone because you're like, it's an amp simulator, being like, or somebody being like, that's a fucking great tone. What did you do to get that? And you're like, oh, that's Gojira plugin. And no way, it sounds awesome. I usually hate amp modelers. So, back to the chat. Sorry about that crash. I've got to go up here. Okay, so yeah, when you're doing these cuts, I just showed you how to do that. Yep, had to make a preset Pro EQ to take care of issues like that. In most IRs, have presets for commonly used ones. See, I would highly advise against using presets for this. Highly advise against it. Do not use presets for this. Like you can have presets with three, like when you say preset, like have your preset. Oh, hang on, everybody. Sorry. Have your preset set up to where maybe you've got, you've got your EQ bands with really narrow cues ready to set up, but don't have frequency set up at all. Because then what you're doing is at that point you're not using your ears and you're not listening. There's too many variables. And there might be some, you're like, yeah, you know what? I'm always doing a cut around 2200, but if you get caught in the preset mode, you're going to think you have to do it when maybe you don't, and you're going to probably end up cutting frequencies that maybe you might be off by 200 hertz. So I would highly advise against not using presets for this. Next question. Question regarding this. Hey, Chris, how's it going? I still got to get you on the show. We got to do a Q&A on the Big Wreck album. It sounds incredible. Chris Holmes, everybody. How do you stop yourself from taking away too much when doing this kind of notching? Yes, that happens. Number one, knowing that you have that tendency, just start small. So I don't even know what I got here. I've got 15 dB of really narrow cut here. I don't want to say that's too much or too little. What I find is most people do these cuts too much in solo. So maybe it's doing these cuts with drums playing or the vocal playing or something else. Maybe not everything, so you can hear these louder than everything else, like it's not completely buried and you're like, I don't know, am I doing anything? Maybe it's doing it with a little bit of something else in the mix going on, so that way you're hearing it a little bit in context, like kind of like half context. I find people when they're doing it in solo, you start carving out everything, and then you put it back in the mix, and it's almost like it kind of disappears a little bit. The other thing I will say, and this isn't something I tend to have an issue with, but this is something that I definitely see when I get sessions from other people where they just leave all their plugins and everything. Try to limit yourself. So say to get started, work within a little bit of a box. For instance, if you were on an SSL, you've only got 2, maybe 3 bands that you can do this with. I don't think the high frequency in bell mode or the low frequency in bell mode for that would get you sharp enough. I would probably say just the 2 mid frequencies. So I would almost treat this as a little bit like an SSL plugin. Give yourself 4 bands. Give yourself a high cut, a low cut, or a high pass, a low pass, and 2 really narrow notches. Or I don't use the notch in FabFilter. I still use the bell, but really narrow. Just limit yourself, and then you're gonna dial in your ear to the frequency that really needs it, and you're not gonna end up with like one of these. This is what I'll show you guys what I see a lot. I'll do it for you. This is what I see a lot when people send me sessions. And ultimately, like, I have to undo it or just start from scratch. I'm going to just do what I see a lot. I'm going to start over and show you what I see a lot. Okay, let me go back to here. Here we go. Okay, this is what I see a lot. And I'm actually going to change these all to notches, because I see this a lot too. Okay, let's crank up. Okay, so I was flicking back and forth. I actually tend, I see this a lot. Maybe not all of these are notches. Like maybe some of them are notches and others are just really sharp bells. But what I was just A-Bing back and forth, if you said to me, like, which one is quote unquote the live cabinet and which one is like the emulation, I probably would have picked the EQ'd one as the emulation. That actually sounded like very kind of fake and lifeless to me. So again, going back to what my suggestion, I would say limit yourself to 2-3 bands and just focus on what is really the problem. Way better, in my opinion. Okay, back to the chat. Hopefully that answered that question. Chris, it's very... Yeah, I just got to your next comment, Chris. Yeah, you end up finding ring upon ring. You get zoned in, right? You start listening for rings, and they're all over the place. But if you take them all out, well, then you have nothing left. At that point, you've just sucked out like all of those harmonic overtones, and it just starts sounding bizarre. That's when it starts sounding fake. And I think that's something I didn't really talk about. Like I always, like, obviously I've been focusing on people not like just almost leaving IRs too much alone. But I think, again, you got an IR, you got a modeler. We've been kind of indoctrinated to think that modelers have a weird high end that we got to get rid of and have all these like rings that we got to get rid of. And it's like, well, yeah, maybe, but maybe like real amps and real cabinets have those too. But we feel like we need to do sometimes you've got one camp that doesn't do anything to the IRs and they're like, oh, this sounds like shit. And it's like, well, yeah, but if you picked a different IR, or if you moved that little dot on the Dynacab, or if you adjusted the phase, or if you adjusted the alignment, and then you have the other camp where they just do way too much. And yes, that you can get zoned in on that too. So limit yourself. Hopefully that will help for sure. And if you find you're chopping into it too much, that's the other thing. Limit yourself. Like 8 dB, like narrow cut like this. I mean, I'm going 15, 18. But if you have a tendency where you're like, man, I always just take too much out, then just do like half. And then as you're mixing or as you're listening, if you're like, man, that's still bugging me, then go adjust it. But the goal isn't to pull it all out. The goal is just to kind of like tame it. So, okay, going down in the chat here a little more. Would you do this EQ tip for live as well, or just recorded? You know what? Unfortunately, I'm not a very good resource for anything live related. So I can't really say. What I would say about live is do whatever sounds good. And if you're listening live and you're like, this doesn't nothing bugs me, don't do anything. If something's bugging you, fix it. And these are just some tools and techniques as to how to fix it, right? Okay, let's go down the chat. Sorry, guys, I'm falling behind a little bit here. I love this, though. What's up, Mike? Paul, I've started miking cabs, not as close as some suggest, usually 4 to 12 off, depending on what I'm going for. Started doing that in IRs and noticed it needs less notching. Yeah, that's the other thing is like, I found... Well, let me pull up. I'm going to pull up the Fractal real quick here. So I've noticed, okay, I'm switching the audio. So now we're hearing the Dynacab. So I've noticed with the Dynacabs and specifically, so you could apply this to any of these sorts of plugins, But I have noticed that my favorite sounding spots visually do not correspond to how I've been miking up guitar cabs for, 20 years. And so you kind of have to just suspend disbelief for a second and not worry about what this looks like. So for instance, not so much on the recto in the Axe FX, but there's another cabinet in particular. I can't remember which one it is. There's one where the only way I can get the thing to sound decent is to be way back here. Like I'm talking about 8 inches, 10 inches off the cab or off the speaker. I don't know if I've ever put I've put a mic there, but that's not a preferred position. That's not where, when I was when we were always miking cabs before this world, I don't know if maybe 1 in 50 sessions I would have a mic a foot off the cabinet. Whereas I'm finding I'm finding some positions, I guess it doesn't go back to a foot, but 24 centimeters is almost a foot. So I'd almost just kind of forget about what it looks like, forget about what the numbers are. Here's something I can give you some insight on. The IRs that are in here. So when you go to a preset, I'm not going to select it, but when you go to a preset, it pulls up a couple speaker IRs that I recorded. They are the positions of the mics here aren't 1-to-1. Because I don't think I ever captured a position out here. So when you move the mic out here and it's around this area, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but if it's around that area, the mic was probably closer to here. But to give you a little bit easier time moving it around so it's not so finicky, so you can actually move it, we scaled it so it's not quite as 1-to-1 as you might think. So don't worry about what it looks like. I would almost not go as far to say as just completely ignore what it looks like. So, okay, back to the chat. If you want accurate guitar tones, you should place a pair of thighs in front of your monitors. That's hilarious. Mike, you're hilarious. Do you find plugins are more mix ready sounding versus modelers in the preset? Is it the 5153? With the sorry, I'm jumping around to questions. So the cabinet, I think the cabinet question, the 5153, it might be the 5153. Everything up close is honky, and then you got to bring it way back, and then it's okay, this is doable. But I would have started a mic there. Bob, your question: do I find plugins are more mix ready sounding than modelers? I will say this, and maybe this is kind of the next phase of the discussion before we start wrapping up, but. There's so many other variables when you're dealing with plugins and modelers. I mean, modelers, because it's usually a device, you can control the DI. So you're plugging into the device. They've picked a DI, or they've picked an input circuit. They've programmed and written the code to look at that to get that particular input circuit. The level, for the most part, on the Fractal, there's no input level. There's an AD level that's just to kind of optimize the analog to digital. But the level is pretty is pretty. They refer to it as a unity gain device. When you're dealing with plugins, there's a lot more variables with the DI, with the level. The Fractal also has an impedance, kind of an impedance matching thing. So they will simulate the impedance of plugging into an amp based off of which amp model it is, I believe. It changes from amp to amp. So you're dealing with less variables, let's say with the Fractal, because because it's its own kind of box, it's its own system. They've controlled some of those variables. And even the way, like, let me pull up the Fractal again. So let me put an amp here really quickly, because again, this is another thing that I probably don't know enough about to really be kind of digging in on a technical level, but whatever. Whatevs. Okay. So there's the section here in the amp of right here. So they've got, because I've got a rectifier slant cab selected, they've programmed all of these parameters to make the amp respond in such a way that it was seeing that speaker cab. And depending on which speaker's cab you're plugged into on a real amp, it's going to interact with the amp differently. So see this curve here? That's the impedance curve. That's how, like, basically the efficiency of how the speaker is being, how the speaker moves at various frequencies and how efficient it is. If I switch this cab to, and I wonder how it picks. Let's go citrus. Let's see if it changes. Yeah, it did. Okay, so now the speaker impedance curve is to a citrus. Now it looks somewhat similar. Let's go change it to something really drastically different. Here, let's go to a 1/8. Okay, now it's starting to look a little different, right? So this is affecting the way the amp and the speaker interact together. When you're dealing with plugins, or you're dealing with an amp and a load box and then putting an IR, you're getting a little bit of that disconnect. So now, again, you're talking about another variable that's not there. So it's so hard to compare. I will say the big difference that I find with the modelers versus the Kempers or the Fractals, so many more people use the Fractals or the Kempers for playing with a speaker at home, playing with a band, hooking it up to a PA, hooking it up in the loop of let's say a Marshall or a Mesa, or feeding it to the front end of a clean Fender. Like, there's so many different use case scenarios with like the Fractals and the Kempers that I feel like a lot of the presets, unless you're buying like preset bundles, or some brands, some of the manufacturers that have different like preset libraries you can install, but a lot of them I find they vary so much that sometimes, like, when you're in a recording situation or you're on your computer and you're scrolling through a Kemper or a Fractal, it's like you can go 5 presets without finding something that you like or that sounds good, and you're like, well, why do these not sound good? But you might put them into a cabinet and they might sound awesome. Plugins, I think, are pretty much the presets in plugins, at least the ones that I know of and the ones that I've been involved with developing, or the ones that I use a lot. Those presets have pretty much been made for recording, and you're hearing them out of studio monitors or out of studio headphones. There's not much regard given to how it sounds coming out of a PA, how it sounds coming out of like a clean power amp with clean, like, full frequency speakers. Like, that's kind of not a thing for the most part. So hope I answered that question. If you guys have any more questions, keep them coming. I think the other thing that is an interesting part of the equation, like I said, is the input. And I find, this isn't so much like cabinet IR dependent, but it could be. You're also dealing with some more gain staging issues that you have to be aware of. DIs, there's not a really great way of knowing that whatever DI you're going through and you're turning on is meeting the level of what the amp that was supposed to be modeling gets when you're using like a DI into your DAW. I know there's one of Joey Sturgis's plugins, I think it's a Tone Forge. They do have like a DI level auto button that actually matches the level, which is great because that takes care of one of those things that's really, I think, a problem when people plug in a DI, they turn the DI up too loud. That's way more level than that the amp would have seen if you plugged that in. And then they write off the modeler because it sounds like shit. It just sounds all fuzzy and gross and whatever. And you're like, well, yeah, if you jacked up the input of, whatever amp you're plugging into the same way, it probably wouldn't sound much better. Plus we're dealing with software. We're not dealing with analog circuits. So there's not that, you're overloading the front end of this, Fender amp, and it's overloading in a somewhat kind of okay way. Like when digital overloads, it's just no good. So there's that problem. There's also the problem of same thing, the gain staging between whatever amp modeler and IR you're using, or if you're using two separate plugins, or if you're using a load box and then capturing the DI of that and then going into an IR loader. Like there's all these variables that ultimately you just need to be aware of, and ultimately you just need to tweak to where it sounds good to you. And so that way you can get results that are better. Like don't just say, oh, well, I put the DI in and I set it to -10, so I'm just going to leave it like that. Play around with the different levels and see what works best. That's another issue that I don't like. It's so difficult to give definitive answers on. Like even the Fractal. And for you guys who've downloaded my preset, like on all my presets, the DI is, I have a separate DI line. The DI level is always too hot. Like I got to turn it all the way down. If I capture just that clean level and then reamped through that level, it would be too loud. And I always have to pat it down. So I just record the DI lower to begin with. It's still a juicy level, but sorry, I wasn't showing my screen there, but okay, what else can I show you guys? I will say, somebody asked me about presets. Oh yes, Jeff, the input light on the CB4. Yeah, there's a little input light here. There's a little input light. And if it starts going off, you're a little too hot. You can trim it down here, or if your DI level is pretty hot, you can trim down your DI level. A couple people reached out to me and asked, like, what are some of my favorite IR libraries? The red wires, I think they call it like the big box library. This was a enlightening to me when I first started really digging in on the Fractal. There was I mean there were IRs in the original version of the Fractal. There were IRs that I thought were good and usable, but I never really got the control that I wanted. And so when I found these red wires IRs, they had kind of the way that I went to mixing in the box. I kind of had to get my head wrapped around recreating my physical world in the box and just have everything be one-to-one. I kind of had to do the same thing to get my head wrapped around the amp emulators. So at the time, and still to this day, one of my favorite cabinets is the Bogner Uberschall cab, the old ones, because they changed. I think the old ones were rear loaded and then they changed it to front loaded. But there was a time they changed how you mount the speaker, and that changed the sound of it. So the older one, whatever that one is, they had an IR pack of this, and I'll actually load it into here. So this Mix IR is their proprietary IR loader, but you can load whatever IRs, but they've got this kind of cool thing here. So the cool thing about the Bogner Uber cab is they've got vintage 30s and T75s. And so what I would do when in the real world, for lack of a better term, I would put a 57 and a 421 on one of the vintage 30s, and I would put a 57 and a 421 on the other vintage 30. And I'd have all four microphones come up on the console, and then I'd push them up, and I'd adjust the phase with like the Little Labs phase sweeper box, and then I would mix them together, and I would just print one amp signal. So the cool thing that I used to do, and I still do to this day, with the red wires, and again, it was enlightening for me because it was just so familiar that it was like, oh, this sounds great. It sounds the way I want, and I can work the way I want. So what I would do is I would load 4 of these IRs, and I would just set it up the exact same way that I used to set it up in the real world. So let's make this the vintage 30. Here's a 57. Let's go a little off the cap, like cap edge, maybe like an inch back. Okay, I'm just going to do this blindly, and then we'll listen. And then I'm going to do a 421. Let's go for, I think I used to use the off axis with this actually. And we'll just start in the same spot. And that's the vintage 30. And then we'll go to the 75. Same thing. And we'll go to the 75. We'll go to 45 degrees. Okay, so now let's hear this. So I've got my vintage 30, 57, vintage 30, 421, 75, 57, 75, 421. All right, let me turn off the Fractal, turn on the red wires, and let's hear what we got. Turn these off really quickly. Okay, let's turn those off. Let's hear the 75. Okay, so it's got this normalize function that sometimes I like and sometimes I don't like. So So what you can do is you can go through and kind of like build your own like kind of chains. And that way, the other thing you can do is you can also then export this. So what I would do, and I was just kind of playing around there, didn't really get to where I wanted, because you can adjust the delays the same way that you can adjust the alignment in in the fractals. But you get to a point where it was like I was getting a sound that was so familiar, and I had all the tweaking tools that I wanted to use the way that I would use them in the real world, to where this kind of got me over the hump and into the box, for lack of a better term, when it came to guitar tones, because it was familiar. But they have so many other ones in here. And like I said, the tool set here is pretty cool. Going on to other stuff that I like, the Own Hammer IRs, they're also very, very good. And you can use those in whatever loader you want. And then, like I said, like if you just want to know, don't have to think about it, like this one's awesome. And I highly recommend this. Like this is kind of like when we were talking about the EQs, when we're like basically giving yourself some limitations to where you can't get caught just EQing for days. This is a really helpful tool for that, because it just gives you a couple options. There's a couple different EQ options. There's a blend or a mix knob or fader here, and that's it. And then obviously the ML stuff is really great as well. This is probably the easiest, like just really quick and easy, gets great sounds, lots of different options, lots of different cabs, lots of different microphone choices. Yeah, big fan of this one for sure. So lots of great stuff. Going back to the chat, and then we'll wrap it up. So fire away with questions. Have I used the York Audio stuff at all? I don't know if I own any of the York Audio stuff, but I've definitely, I have a couple friends and a couple clients that I've worked with that do. Another helpful thing, if you're a Fractal user, years ago, I bought a plugin or a preset bundle from Austin Buddy, and he's got a really great bundle that's basically just like a real world. Like if you plugged in a Fender Deluxe and just kind of set it to a good sounding setting, you're like, there it is. And so he did this for every single amp model, and so it's kind of like a more of a bare bones preset, but there's one for every amp model. So you can very quickly just scroll through a bunch of amps, a bunch of presets, and just get a feel for like, well, what's that amp sound like kind of like in its most kind of ideal setting, or and some of the presets just get a little too, like, I get it. I've made presets for plugins. Sometimes you're just like, does this preset just sound the same as the last four that I did? So then you start overdoing it because you don't want it to sound the same as the other four. So I think a lot of presets just sound like there's too much going on. And so the Austin Buddy bundle is very kind of like, I mean, there's a lot in it, but it's not kind of going for, the kitchen sink kind of thing. So he really levels his stuff well too. Yeah. I mean, and that's the other thing. I mean, that's not as much of an issue for me, because obviously just being in the studio, like I can just grab gain level knobs. But when you're plugging into an amp or you're live or whatever like that, that can be a pain in the butt. So, any more questions about everything? I know this is kind of like I said, it's there's so many variables. It just, again, proves the point that you really need to go in and use your ears to figure out what it is that you want. Don't be afraid to use the tools that you have to deal with problems that, if you would fix those problems if it was a real amp too. Like maybe the frequencies are a little different. The other thing that I didn't mention, actually, while you guys are thinking of some questions, one trap that I used to get caught in a lot, and ultimately, I think, again, thinking of like real world versus capabilities in the box. I used to put too many IRs on at the same time. I used to always have, you know, let's say I would have in any IR loader. I mean, Fractal, you were limited to 4, but then you had a separate cabinet block that I would add a split. So at any point in time, I would have 8 IRs available, ready to turn on and mix together. And I found myself like turning them on and actually using them. And what would end up happening was the same way I probably would never mic up a guitar cabinet with 8 mics. I started doing things that I wouldn't have done in the real world and then wondered why it didn't sound that good. And so I bet you if I put 8 mics on a guitar cabinet and tried to mix them all together, it probably also wouldn't sound good. So try limiting IRs as well. Like try limiting yourself to mixing no more than 2 IRs together at any given time, and just see kind of if you can get better results, or if you can get to where you want to go faster. The other issue with that is when you start adding all of these, we talked about kind of the alignment. When you start adding, the more IRs that you add and the more that they are perfectly aligned, again, the less lifelike that's going to be, because that's so difficult to do in the real world. That's not a sound that we're used to hearing. We're not used to hearing 4 mics on a guitar cabinet all in the same spot, all in perfect phase. That's not a sound that's familiar because it's very difficult to do. So, yeah, I think I covered everything. Check my notes. Oh, the other thing, just kind of just summarize here, because this is also something that I find I get a lot when a lot of sessions I get from people. You've seen how easy it is to completely change the sound of a guitar amp or emulator just by moving the little Dynacab dot a little bit, or changing the IR completely. If you are using amp emulators, or if you're using IRs and you're sending your stuff off, or even if you're mixing your own tracks, commit, make a decision. If you were working in the real world and you mic'd up a guitar cabinet, maybe you recorded the amp separate as well with a load box, and you've given that option to the mixer. But most of the time, you've made a decision and you've committed. So at the very least, yeah, include the DI, include the amp DI, whatever. Like, that's fine too. But commit to something. And treat it a little bit like as if you recorded a real guitar amp, to where you're going to decide on something, print it. And I think if you put the pressure on yourself to commit to something, I think ultimately you'll probably spend a little bit more time and a little more effort and be a little bit more intentional about getting a sound that you're happy with and that you like. And I think ultimately the more of us who, the better sounds that we are able to collectively create with modelers and IRs, the less of a disconnect there will be, and the less, sides there will be, because we'll be able to show people how great these tools can make your recordings. So yeah, that was the other thing I definitely wanted to touch upon, because I think a lot of people don't. They use it as a scapegoat when they're using amp modelers. They use it as a scapegoat, or even IRs. They'll use it as an excuse to not have to commit and make a decision on what do you like. What do you like hearing? What's your style? When you're recording, or when you're playing that song with your band in the recording studio, what sound inspires you? What sound gels with what you want your sound to be? Commit to that. So, okay. Back to the chat. Oh, you guys are so welcome. Thank you guys for jumping on. Wasn't as much of a marathon as some of the others, but we've been talking for a couple hours about cabinet IRs, impulse responses. Yeah. Yeah, and if there's like I said, if there's any other questions that you guys do have, I know I've mentioned this on a couple of the other videos. I mean, I love hearing from you guys. So definitely don't take this as a don't DM me. Um, definitely reach out. I love hearing the comments. I love hearing everybody's experience, and love that. But if you do have a question, like, just post it on your socials and tag me. It'll help grow the channel. It'll help grow the community. Oh, I almost missed one really big thing. Got to come back to that. Post the question on your socials, tag me, or on my page. Like, just go on, I'll, maybe what I'll start doing is I'll start doing maybe a Q&A in Instagram once a week that I can just kind of answer as I'm taking ear breaks from mixing and all this other fun stuff. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I almost completely forgot this. So I mentioned at the beginning of the stream that you can go to my webpage and subscribe to my, I'm not calling them the newsletters because they're not really going to be necessarily newsletters. They're more going to be when I have presets, when I have samples, when I have, if there are any like kind of quick, tips, that would be kind of like exclusive stuff that quick and easy to address questions that I'm getting a lot. There's just going to be some exclusive content there that will only be available if you've signed up. But I've had a lot of requests over the last month or so to start a Discord community. So I have set that up, and I am going to send out an invite to everybody who's on my mailing list. So if you want to be a part of the Discord community, go to my website, chrisbaseford.com. Go to the bottom, give me your email address. I won't spam you. I'm not selling your email address. I'm not going to send you crap that you don't want. I mean, there might be some crap you don't want, but you can just delete the email. But I'm going to try to send out stuff that's actually desirable and useful and informative. So, but I will be sending out an invite to anybody who's on the list to join the Discord community. I don't know Discord very well. So just tempered expectations when you go on and sign up. It's probably going to start off kind of slow, but I will jump in there as much as I can. And what I'm hoping is I see a lot of the same faces showing up for the live streams. I'm hoping this will give us a little bit of an opportunity, number one, to continue these conversations offline, and to where you guys can kind of interact with each other. I see some people in the chat here like giving great tips, great points. Different opinions. Like, that's the other thing, right? I'm here telling you what I like. The guitar sound that I like might not be the guitar sound that you like. So it'll be pretty cool to be able to kind of connect with people who have differing opinions, who have different experiences. And ultimately, I thought that was kind of a good place to do it. So go check that out if it's interests you at all. And yeah. Oh, hang on, one more thing. Still have to try to get your nailer super drive in Cliff's hands. Sean, if you know Cliff, set that up. Or I know some of the guys from Fractal. I haven't really like pounced on anybody. I mentioned it kind of more in passing, but yeah, I've got 2 amps in specific that I think. It says here, when I click the confirmation email for the email list, it says access denied. Huh, that's weird. All right, let me go in and check that. Yeah, thanks for your patience with this, guys. I'm kind of breaking new ground with a lot of this stuff over the last few months, so you got to bear with me. Yeah, if you're having issues with the getting your access, getting on the email list, if stuff like that's happening, feel free to reach out to me through Instagram, and I'll either figure out what the problem is or manually add you to the list. So all good. But yeah, for the Fractals, definitely, I'd love to get that super drive in the Fractal. I've got a VHT Pitbull that I would love to get in there. You know what? I've got a bunch of amps that we were going to do. Miko was going to do. We were actually going to do 6 amp plugins. So the CB4 was the first one. We were going to do another 5, but they kind of fell by the wayside, unfortunately. Miko just got absolutely busy with other stuff, and So I don't think those are ever going to happen. But next best thing with them being in would be getting those in the Fractal or something similar. So that would be awesome. Jeff, you need the CB4. Trust me. Yep. Thank you, buddy. Yeah, the CB4 is pretty cool. I definitely don't want this channel to be a hawking gear or plugins or any of that stuff, but I do use the CB4 a lot. One of the reasons why the other 5 aren't coming out was because the CB4 was a challenge to get to where I was happy and would stamp my literally my name on it and release it. And so it was above and beyond what I think ML had not. I mean, their other stuff was great. That's why I'm working with them. But it was kind of like next level, and it took a lot longer, and it was a little bit more of a challenge. But ultimately, the payoff was it's a very usable, great amp plug-in with lots of great sounds. And so there's my sales pitch for the night. Okay. If any more questions, feel free to throw them in the comments of the video. Like I said, I'll jump on those as I see them pop up. DM me if you've got any ideas for topics that you want me to cover. If there's any guests, I'm going to start doing guests. That's the other kind of little announcement here. I've got a few people that I'm starting to get lined up to be on. And yeah, we're just going to kind of use this as a platform to talk shop. There's a few kind of like non-Pro Tools specific topics that would be really great. Jeff just called me a shill. You know me. Anyway, so yeah, we're going to be, we'll just kind of be talking some shop, a little more like technical stuff, but love getting other people's opinions. And I have these conversations offline all the time. I figured let's do some guests on this. So if there's anybody that you would want to, that you think would be interested in coming on as well, that you know, and you could kind of connect those dots, feel free to connect those dots or suggest them or have people reach out to me. So, holy shnikes, somebody's from Scotland. Scotland, man, I appreciate you tuning in. It's definitely, I guess, early there. Yeah. You and I wear the same glasses, but you are better looking. Well, I can't see you, so I don't know. Maybe you're just being kind, and that's not actually the case. So, hope to see a Fractal preset for the VH4 soon. Yep, that's actually the next one that I'm going to be sending out. I'm still playing catch up from the holidays, and I haven't had a chance to kind of finish it off. I want to make sure it's kind of complete for everybody. But yeah, I'll send that out to everybody on the mailing list as well. So, all right. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. I know you have all subscribed. Everybody in the chat has subscribed, because if you hadn't, it wouldn't let you chat. If anybody's watching that hasn't subscribed yet, please do so. And then follow me on all the socials. Let's keep this train rolling. As long as you guys are interested, I'll keep doing them. So, thank you so much. Appreciate you guys sticking with me for 2.5 hours on a Friday night and Friday morning for some of you. And yeah, until next time, probably not next week, not the week after, because I'm out of town, the week after that. So bear with me. It's going to be 3 weeks, but I will see you guys then. Thank you so much. Everybody stay happy, stay healthy, stay productive, and keep those guitar tones sounding awesome. And until next time, thank you. Talk to you later.